You ever been in a conversation where you're saying all the words, but somehow it still feels like you're not being heard? You're showing up, you're trying. And yet, every exchange turns into a misunderstanding or a shutdown or a quiet resentment that just stacks on top of the last one. That's the part nobody talks about, how exhausting it is to love someone and still feel alone in the way you communicate. Not because you don't care, but because you're both speaking from places that have never been fully seen or understood. And the truth is, most of us were never taught how to communicate in a way that heals instead of harms. We learned how to argue, how to defend, how to retreat, but not how to pause to listen, to speak from truth without making someone else feel like the enemy. This isn't about having the right words. This is about learning how to honor what you feel without weaponizing it, and how to hear someone else without abandoning yourself in the process. Better communication isn't loud, it's not fancy, it's steady, and it's kind, and it's rooted in self-respect. And once you learn how to speak from that place, everything in your relationships begins to shift. A lot of people walk around carrying conversations that never got resolved, words they never got to say, moments they still replay, wondering if they could have said it better or softer or louder. And that weight doesn't just sit in your mind, it shows up in your body, in your relationships, in the way you pull back or push too hard. Communication isn't just about talking, it's about feeling safe enough to be honest and strong enough to stay kind. And for a lot of us, that balance was never modeled. So we either shut down to keep the peace, or we speak up and lose it. But the truth is, there's a way to communicate that protects your peace without abandoning your truth. That brings clarity, not confusion. That makes room for connection, not just correction. That's what we're going to walk through together today. Not theory, not perfection, just the real, everyday way to speak with calm, with clarity, and with respect, both for yourself and for the people you care about. One of the hardest things to do in a relationship is to speak up without immediately going into defense mode, especially when you feel misunderstood, accused, or judged. Your first instinct is to protect yourself. And that makes sense. It comes from a very real place. Maybe you've been blamed too quickly in the past. Maybe no one really heard your side growing up. Maybe you're used to having to justify everything you feel. So now, when tension shows up, you lead with defense instead of honesty. You explain yourself before you even say what's really bothering you. You over-talk. You interrupt. You try to win instead of connect. But what you're actually doing, without realizing it, is building a wall between you and the person you care about. See, defensiveness is often just unspoken fear. Fear that you won't be heard. Fear that what you say will be used against you. Fear that if you don't fight for your side, you'll be left with blame you don't deserve. But here's what's important to understand: when your words come wrapped in defense, the other person doesn't feel your heart, they feel your guard. And that changes everything about how they receive you. It's hard to connect with someone who's trying to protect themselves more than they're trying to be real. It's hard to listen when you're being pushed instead of invited in. That's why arguments spiral. That's why conversations feel like battles. Not because you don't care, but because your fear is speaking louder than your clarity. Speaking without defending yourself first doesn't mean you're weak. It doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're grounded. It means you trust your own voice enough to let the other person hear your truth without needing to cover it in explanations. It means you can say, "That hurt," without following it up with 5 reasons why you have the right to feel that way. It means you know the difference between sharing your experience and trying to win an argument. And I get it. That's not always easy, especially when emotions are high or when you feel like you've been misunderstood for a long time. But that's where real strength shows up. In the pause, in the breath, in the moment you choose clarity over control. Next time you're in a tough conversation, try slowing down. Before you respond, ask yourself, am I speaking to be understood, or am I speaking to protect myself? And if it's the second, take a moment, drop the defense. Lead with what's true, not what's loud, because that's what creates real connection. Not the perfect words, but the honest ones, the ones that come from a place of self-respect, not self-protection. You don't have to prove yourself in every conversation. You just have to be present enough to show up with honesty. That's how you get heard. That's how you stop fighting for your point and start fighting for your peace. There's a moment in every relationship where you say something that matters to you, and it doesn't land. You explain, you rephrase, you even raise your voice a little, not to be aggressive, but because you're desperate to be understood. But instead of connection, you get more silence, or worse, defensiveness. And now the room is full of tension and you're left feeling unheard, dismissed, invisible. That moment right there. That's where so many people start yelling. Not always with volume. Sometimes it's the sharp tone, the sarcasm, the repeating yourself over and over until it feels like you're begging for clarity that never comes. It's not that you're trying to dominate the conversation. You're trying to matter in it. You're trying to feel like your voice has weight, like what you're saying isn't just bouncing off walls. But here's the truth most of us weren't taught. When people don't hear you, yelling doesn't make them listen better. It usually makes them shut down. Not because you're wrong, and not because what you're saying doesn't matter, but because the energy shifts from connection to correction. And the second someone feels like they're being talked at instead of talked to, they stop receiving your message. They start building their own defense. And now you've got two people protecting their positions and no one moving toward each other. Getting clear means taking your message and stripping away everything that clouds it. The frustration, the fear, the need to convince. It means saying what you feel without making the other person the villain. It means letting your clarity do the work, not your intensity. And I know that's hard, especially when you feel like you've said the same thing 100 times and nothing changes. But clarity isn't about repetition. It's about emotional direction. It's the difference between saying, "You never listen to me," and saying, "When I talk and you keep scrolling, I feel like what I'm saying doesn't matter." One is an accusation, the other is a truth, and truth makes room for connection, even in hard moments. What most people don't realize is that clarity doesn't mean detachment, doesn't mean being cold. It means being steady, grounded, emotionally responsible. It means you're not handing your piece over to someone else's reaction. You're standing in it. And from that place, your words don't have to fight. They land, not always perfectly, not always immediately, but they land in a way that gives the relationship a chance to breathe instead of break. So the next time you feel the urge to raise your voice just to be heard, pause. Ask yourself, am I being clear or just loud? Then soften. Not your message, your delivery. Come back to your center. Speak the truth, not the noise around it, because yelling might get attention, but clarity gets understanding. And in the end, that's what you're really after. To be known, to be seen, and to be heard for who you are, not how loud you can be. It's easy to talk about how you feel when everything's going well, but in relationships, the real test comes when you're hurt or disappointed or frustrated. That's when emotions run high and the need to protect yourself kicks in. And without realizing it, you start talking at the other person instead of with them. You bring your pain into the conversation like it's a weapon instead of a wound. Not because you want to hurt them, but because you're trying to be heard, and somewhere along the way, you learn that the only way to be heard is to push. But here's the thing most people never learn. You can say exactly what you feel without turning the other person into the enemy. The problem is most of us are scared. Scared that if we don't speak with power, we'll be dismissed. Scared that if we don't point the finger, the blame will land on us. So we come in hot. You always do this. You never care. I can't believe you would treat me like that. And in doing that, we lose the actual message, because now the other person is defending themselves instead of listening. And now the conversation becomes a battle, not a bridge. What started as a need to express turns into a fight to survive. Saying what you feel is one of the most courageous things you can do in a relationship. But the how matters just as much as the what. You can say, "I feel hurt," without saying, "You're selfish." You can say, "I felt shut out," without saying, "You never care about me." Because the moment you make someone your enemy, they stop being your partner. And now, instead of repairing the relationship, you're both trying to protect your side of the field. But when you speak from your center, calm, honest, grounded, you give your emotions room to breathe without suffocating the other person. You give yourself the dignity of being heard for what's really going on underneath the anger. Because behind the frustration is usually something softer. I didn't feel chosen. I felt small. I felt like I didn't matter in that moment. Those are the things we bury under sharp words. But those are the things that actually need to be said. This doesn't mean you water yourself down. It doesn't mean you ignore the hurt. It just means you deliver your truth in a way that invites the other person to see you instead of defend themselves from you. That's emotional strength. That's relational maturity. That's how real connection gets built, not by avoiding conflict, but by moving through it with clarity and respect. So the next time you feel that fire rising, pause, breathe, and ask yourself, am I saying what I feel, or am I trying to win this moment? Then drop the armor, lead with truth, not attack. Let your words reflect what you value, not just what you're angry about. Because the goal isn't to defeat the person you love. it's to reach them. And that only happens when you stop making them the enemy and start showing them your heart. There's a kind of silence that feels like relief, like space to breathe after an argument, a moment to gather your thoughts. But then there's the other kind, the silence that stretches for days, that lingers in the air like something left unfinished. That silence doesn't bring peace, it builds distance. And for a lot of people, that's become the pattern. You disagree, you get overwhelmed, and instead of working through it, you go quiet. Not because you don't care, but because you don't know how to keep the connection without making things worse. You pull back to keep the peace, but slowly that peace turns into disconnection. And over time, you stop talking about the small things. Then you stop talking about the big things. And eventually you stop talking about the real things altogether. That's how people drift, not with one big blow up, but with unspoken words and unresolved tension. You think silence is keeping things calm, but what it's really doing is keeping things stuck. And I get it. Silence can feel safer. Maybe every time you've spoken up, it turned into a fight. Maybe you've been told you're too sensitive or too much or too dramatic. So now you tell yourself it's not worth it. You swallow it. You shut down. You pretend everything's okay because it's quieter that way. But quiet isn't the same thing as healed. And avoidance isn't the same thing as peace. Peace in a relationship comes from presence, from two people showing up, even when it's uncomfortable. It comes from the courage to say, this bothered me, or I don't feel close to you lately, or can we talk about what just happened? Not to stir up drama, but to keep the connection honest. And that kind of peace requires both people to feel safe enough to speak and mature enough to listen. When silence takes over, nobody knows where the other person stands. You stop asking, you stop sharing, and slowly it starts to feel like you're doing life next to each other, not with each other. If you've been using silence to avoid conflict, just know the conflict is still there. It doesn't go away just because no one's talking about it. It just gets buried deeper, and buried emotions don't stay buried. They show up later, in resentment, in distance, in sudden outbursts you can't explain. So when you feel yourself shutting down, pause, ask yourself what you're trying to protect, and then ask yourself what that silence is costing you. Because sometimes the very thing you're trying to avoid, the hard conversation, the awkward moment, the temporary tension, is the exact thing that could bring you closer. Peace is not the absence of noise. It's the presence of understanding, and you can't get there without your voice. So speak gently, honestly, even if your voice shakes, because the relationship that's built on silence isn't peaceful. It's slowly disappearing. And the only way back to connection is through the courage to break the silence. There's a quiet hope a lot of people carry in relationships, that if we just give it time, the hard things will go away. That if we keep the peace, smile through the tension, distract ourselves with routine, somehow the pain will work itself out. But the truth is, time doesn't heal what you won't face, and love alone doesn't fix what stays unspoken. You can't work through something you're unwilling to name. You can't heal a pattern you keep pretending isn't there. And yet, so many of us get stuck in that loop, holding our breath, waiting for the other person to just get it without ever actually having the conversation. Maybe it's fear that if you bring it up, it'll explode. Or fear that you'll be blamed, dismissed, made to feel too emotional. So you bottle it. You avoid it. You convince yourself it's not worth the fight. But here's the cost. What doesn't get addressed doesn't disappear. It builds. It shows up in the way you pull away, in the sarcasm, in the cold shoulder, in the way you stop reaching for them when something's wrong. Suddenly, the relationship feels like walking on eggshells, but no one wants to admit the floor is already cracked. Real connection requires real conversations, the kind that feel uncomfortable, the kind that make you nervous. But those are the moments where growth actually begins. When you sit down, look someone in the eye and say, this keeps happening and it's hurting us. Not to point fingers, not to assign blame, but to bring light to what's been hidden in the dark. Because when you talk about it, really talk about it, you stop fighting each other and start fighting for the relationship. And that starts with emotional honesty. Saying, I feel disconnected, instead of pretending everything's fine. Saying, I miss how we used to talk, instead of waiting for the other person to notice. Saying, this hurts, without dressing it up in anger or silence. That's how healing begins. Not with the perfect words, but with the willingness to speak when it would be easier to stay quiet. But here's something else to remember. Talking about it doesn't guarantee it'll be fixed overnight. These conversations take patience. They take consistency. Sometimes they bring up things neither of you are ready to face. But silence doesn't protect the relationship. It only delays the fallout, and the longer you wait, the harder it becomes to find your way back. If something is broken between you, if there's a distance growing, a pattern that's harming, a wound that keeps reopening, say something. Don't wait for the perfect time. Don't wait until you're boiling over. Do it calmly. Do it clearly. Because what you won't talk about is already costing you more than you think. But once you name it, once you're both in the light together, that's where real repair can start. Not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. And that's what makes all the difference. There's a shift that happens in relationships when the goal of a conversation changes from being right to being understood. And for a lot of us, that shift never gets taught. We grow up learning how to argue a point, how to win debates, how to defend ourselves at all costs. So when conflict shows up, especially with someone close to us, we go into that mode. We listen just long enough to respond. We stack our evidence. We point out flaws, and we get so caught up in proving we're right that we lose sight of the relationship right in front of us. Here's the hard truth. Being right feels good in the moment, but it rarely brings you closer. You might win the point, but lose the connection. You might get the last word, but walk away more distant than you were before. Because at the end of the day, most arguments aren't really about facts. They're about feelings. They're about fear, hurt, disappointment, or unmet needs. And when you're more focused on defending your position than understanding their perspective, you end up stepping over the very thing that needs attention. Talking to be understood means slowing down long enough to ask yourself, what's the heart of what I'm trying to say? And am I saying it in a way the other person can actually receive? Because if the delivery doesn't match the intention, the message gets lost. You might be saying something true, but if it's wrapped in criticism, sarcasm, or control, it's going to be met with resistance, not reflection. And that's where the cycle starts. One person pushes, the other shuts down or pushes back, and now you're both just talking at each other. Louder, sharper, harder, without ever really hearing what's underneath the noise. But when you shift the goal, when you stop trying to prove and start trying to connect, everything softens. You can say, I felt hurt when that happened, instead of, you never think about me. You can say, I want us to work through this, instead of, you always make things worse. That doesn't mean you silence your truth. It means you deliver it from a place that invites understanding, not just compliance. And that takes emotional maturity. It takes humility, because sometimes being understood also means you have to be willing to understand them too. You have to let go of the scoreboard. You have to listen to the parts that make you uncomfortable. You have to accept that maybe your tone, your timing, or your assumptions played a role too. That's not weakness. That's wisdom. That's choosing the relationship over the argument. So the next time you feel yourself gearing up to make your point, pause. Breathe. Ask yourself, do I want to win this moment, or do I want us to move forward together? Because in the end, being right might satisfy your pride, but being understood feeds your connection. And real love, real partnership is built on the quiet strength of two people who care more about hearing each other than defeating each other. When emotions are running high, everything in your body wants to react. Your heart races, your voice rises, your thoughts get louder and faster. And before you know it, you're in the middle of a conflict that feels more like survival than communication. That's the moment where most people try to outtalk each other to prove, to push, to defend. And in all that noise, the one thing that rarely shows up is calm. But here's the thing, calm doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean you're giving in. Calm is not weakness. It's power under control. It's the kind of presence that commands attention, not by force, but by groundedness. In conflict, calm is the loudest language in the room, because calm changes the atmosphere. When one person holds their peace, it disrupts the pattern of escalation. It forces a pause. It creates space. It says, I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to understand what's going on between us. That kind of calm is disarming, because most people expect conflict to come with fire. They expect defensiveness, yelling, dismissiveness. But when you respond with clarity and composure, it throws off the rhythm of the argument, not to manipulate, but to remind both of you. This doesn't have to spiral. And I know it's not easy, especially when you feel triggered, especially when you've been misunderstood for the 100th time. You want to raise your voice just to match the intensity you're feeling inside. But here's what I've learned. Matching chaos with chaos never brings peace. When someone's storming, the last thing they need is another storm. What they need, what you need, is an anchor. And sometimes you have to be that anchor for the both of you. That means knowing how to slow your own breath before you speak. Choosing to respond with, help me understand what you're trying to say, instead of, here you go again. It means keeping your tone steady even when the volume in the room rises, not because you're cold, but because you care enough not to let the moment control you. Calm says, I can hold what I'm feeling without letting it run the conversation. And when you learn to lead with calm, not perfection, but calm, you start to notice something. The other person begins to soften too. Maybe not right away, but over time, your consistency teaches them that this relationship is a safe place to land, even when things get hard. It doesn't mean you won't have disagreements. It means the way you handle them builds trust instead of tearing it down. So the next time conflict rises, remember, the loudest person isn't the strongest. The most reactive person isn't the most honest. Strength looks like self-control. Love sounds like patience. And real resolution begins when just one person, even if it's just you, decides to stop fighting for control and start standing in calm. That's what sets the tone. That's what invites healing. That's what makes space for real change. One of the quietest ways relationships begin to break down is through assumptions. We stop asking and we start guessing. We assume they know how we feel. We assume we know what they meant. We assume silence means safety, distance means disinterest, and mood shifts mean something about us. And before long, we're reacting to a story we created in our head, not to the actual person in front of us. The danger in that is subtle, but it runs deep. Because connection doesn't survive on assumptions. It survives on clarity, curiosity, and conversation. Think about it. You come home, your partner's quieter than usual. No eye contact, short answers. You assume they're upset with you, so you pull back, or get defensive, or go silent yourself. What started as a long day for them becomes a full-blown emotional wall between the two of you. Not because anyone wanted it that way, but because neither of you asked what was real. And this happens in friendships, marriages, even parent-child relationships. We fill in the blanks with our own fears and past wounds. We stop checking in, and we start drifting apart, all while thinking we know what's going on. Assumptions are easy because they let us stay in control. If I can explain your behavior in my own head, I don't have to risk the vulnerability of asking. I don't have to sit in the unknown. But that false control costs us something big: intimacy. Because real connection only happens in the of knowing, in the asking, in the listening, in the moments where you say, hey, you've felt a little distant lately. Is everything okay? Or, I know I'm quiet when I get overwhelmed. I just want you to know it's not about you. That kind of honesty builds bridges. It breaks the pattern. It closes the gap before it turns into a canyon. What keeps people from doing this most of the time is fear. Fear that if they ask, they'll hear something they don't want to hear. Fear that their intuition is right and the distance is personal. So they protect themselves by assuming, by interpreting, by never actually checking in. But relationships that last, the ones built on real trust, they're not afraid of the uncomfortable questions. They welcome them. Because the goal isn't to avoid tension. The goal is to stay aligned through it. If something feels off, say something. Not in a way that blames, but in a way that invites, can I check in with you? Is a lot more powerful than, why are you acting like that? And here's how I experienced that moment opens more doors than you always do this. Ask, share, clarify. Don't let your mind write a story that your heart never got the chance to understand. Assumptions build distance. Curiosity builds connection. So keep choosing curiosity, keep choosing clarity. Because at the end of the day, love can't thrive in a relationship full of silent guesses. It needs truth. And truth doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from being willing to ask and brave enough to listen. Most people don't set out to build walls in their relationships. It just happens slowly. You let something slide, then something else, a comment that rubbed you wrong, a moment where you didn't feel seen, a need that went unmet. But instead of bringing it up, you tell yourself it's not worth the conflict. You convince yourself that keeping the peace is the mature thing to do. So you stay quiet, and you hope that the other person will just notice, that they'll figure it out without you having to say anything. But they don't. And every time you avoid saying the hard thing, a brick goes up. One brick of silence, one brick of resentment, one brick of loneliness, until eventually you look up and realize there's a wall between you. Avoiding hard conversations doesn't just protect the relationship from tension, it protects it from truth. And the thing is, truth is what intimacy is built on. When you don't speak up, you start to disconnect, not just from them, but from yourself. You begin to shrink your needs, soften your boundaries, and carry things that were never yours to carry, all to avoid that one moment of discomfort. And over time, that silence starts to feel safer than the risk of being honest. But it's not safety, it's distance disguised as peace. We avoid hard conversations for a lot of reasons. Maybe you've tried before and it didn't go well. Maybe you were told growing up that expressing emotion was weakness, or maybe you just don't know how to say what you feel without it turning into an argument. That's real, and it's human, but what's also real is the cost. Because when you keep choosing silence, you don't just avoid conflict. You avoid connection. And that's what people forget. The same conversation you're avoiding could be the exact conversation that brings you closer. You don't need perfect words to have a hard conversation. You just need honesty, respect, and a willingness to stay present. You can say, "This is hard for me to bring up, but I need to be honest with you." You can say, "I've been holding this in, and I realize that's not fair to either of us." You can speak from your experience instead of from accusation. Because the goal isn't to win. The goal is to be real, to be seen, to be understood. Relationships don't fall apart because of one big fight. They fall apart because of 100 little things that never got talked about. Unspoken hurt, missed opportunities to clear the air, things that went unsaid until they turned into assumptions, and assumptions that turned into distance. And distance that eventually felt normal. So if something's sitting heavy on your chest, say something. Don't let fear be the architect of a wall you never meant to build. Speak with care. Speak with calm. But speak because every hard conversation you choose to have tears down a brick. And every brick you take down is one step closer to the connection you've been missing. Respect is easy when everything's calm, when you're rested, understood, and everything feels aligned. Your words come out smooth, your tone stays kind, and your presence feel steady. But the real test of respect isn't when things are going well. It's when tension hits. It's when you feel hurt, dismissed, backed into a corner. That's when the real version of how you communicate shows up. And in relationships, that moment matters more than most people realize, because how you speak under stress tells the other person everything they need to know about how safe they are with you. It's not about pretending you're fine when you're not. It's not about bottling your emotions or silencing what needs to be said. It's about how you express it. Because under pressure, we all have patterns. Maybe you get sharp with your words. Maybe you get loud or cold or completely shut down. Those responses might feel like they're protecting you in the moment, but they chip away at trust over time. You can't build respect in a relationship if every conflict becomes a battlefield. And you can't expect someone to feel emotionally safe if stress always flips a switch and turns communication into chaos. We've all had moments we wish we could take back. That one thing you said in anger. That tone that hit harder than the words themselves. And what makes those moments painful isn't just what was said. It's how it made the other person feel. Disrespected, unseen, unsafe. That's the kind of damage that doesn't always leave visible marks, but it lingers. It changes how they show up next time, how open they feel, how close they're willing to get. Respect during conflict sounds like, "I'm upset, but I'm still choosing to speak to you like you matter." It sounds like, "I need a minute to cool off because I don't want to say something I can't take back." It sounds like knowing your tone carries weight and choosing not to use it as a weapon. And that kind of discipline, emotional discipline, is something you build. It's not natural at first. Especially if you grew up in an environment where yelling, shutting down, or walking away was the norm. But what was modeled for you doesn't have to be repeated by you. You can learn to slow the moment down, to catch yourself before the words leave your mouth, to name what you're feeling without attacking the person in front of you. That's not weakness. That's maturity. That's someone who knows their power and chooses to use it gently. Because respect isn't just about saying, "I love you." When things are good, it's about proving it when things are hard. When everything in you wants to lash out, but you choose presence over pride. When you let your character, not your emotions, lead the conversation, that's the kind of respect that builds safety. That earns trust. That keeps people leaning in instead of pulling away. And in the end, how you communicate under stress doesn't just define the moment. It defines the relationship.